Welcome, dear listeners, to a journey through time and the human heart. Today I will share with you a story that sprouted from the Bahian lands of 1887, when Brazil breathed the last sighs of slavery and the first winds of freedom. It is a narrative about lost orphans who found a mother, about a single woman who discovered her true calling, and about how love can flourish even in the most arid terrains of adversity. This is the story of Maria Conceição and the orphans of Cachoeira, a tale of hope, dignity and transformation that still resonates in our hearts today. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this video from? I want to know every corner of Brazil and the world that our story will reach. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. That helps me a lot to continue bringing these touching narratives to you. Year 1887. Place, Cachoeira, Recôncavo Baiano, Bahia. Now close your eyes and come with me to a small railway station where it all began. The September rain fell obliquely over the rusted rails of Cachoeira station, each drop carrying with it the weight of an era that refused to die. The steam from the last train dissipated like ghosts in the humid afternoon air, leaving behind only the metallic echo of the carriages and four small figures huddled under the worn wooden marquee. Joaquim, at 13 years old, had shoulders curved by responsibilities that should belong to adults. His calloused hands firmly held Rosa's, a 5-year-old girl whose large eyes seemed like two pools of rain reflecting the grey sky. Beside him, Francisca pressed against her chest a rosary of worn beads, the only inheritance from a mother who had departed too early for heaven. The youngest of the group, 8-year-old Sebastian, remained mute since witnessing the definitive departure of the only person who had loved him. The smell of creosote from the railroad ties mixed with the sweet aroma of nearby cashew trees, creating a perfumed melancholy that would forever impregnate the memory of that moment. The children's clothes, once colourful, now carried the dust of roads and the invisible marks of a journey that had begun with tears and didn't know where it would end. "The man said he would return," whispered Francisca, more to herself than to the others, her words getting lost in the constant murmur of the rain. Joaquim knew the man would not return. He knew, as boys forced to grow up before their time know, with a bitter wisdom that settles in the chest like red-hot iron. His eyes scanned the empty station, the fogged windows of the only nearby house, the mud path that snaked between banana trees until it was lost in the distance. It was then that he spotted the woman. She emerged from the curve of the road like an apparition, wrapped in a dark shawl that protected her from the drizzle. Her steps were firm despite the mud, and there was something in her upright posture that spoke of dignity preserved even in the face of adversity. Maria Conceição Cavalcanti carried in her arms a wicker basket, and on her face the expression of someone who had left home with a simple purpose and was about to discover that destiny had other plans. When her eyes met the four small abandoned figures, something moved in her chest. It wasn't pity. She knew that emotion too well to confuse it with what she felt now. It was recognition, the recognition of lost souls meeting at a crossroads of time. The children watched her in silence, small wounded animals assessing whether they should trust or flee. Rosa hid her face in Joaquim's shoulder, while Francisca murmured prayers quietly, the rosary beads sliding between her tiny fingers. Maria Conceição approached slowly, her leather shoes making small sounds on the wet wood of the platform. She said no word at first. She had learned that sometimes silence speaks louder than any promise. She simply knelt before Rosa, who peeked through her fingers, and offered her a small cassava cake that she took from the basket. The girl looked at Joaquim, seeking permission. He nodded almost imperceptibly, and Rosa extended a trembling little hand to accept the gift. The simple gesture broke an invisible barrier, and Maria Conceição knew that her life had just taken a completely new direction. But what she didn't know yet was that the eyes watching her from the road were not just those of children in need of protection. The house of the Santa Conceição mill rose at the end of the road like a haughty lady who refused to accept her decadence. Its adobe walls, once whitest white, now displayed humidity stains that drew maps of non-existent countries. The green shutters hung misaligned, some missing slats, others completely closed for so long that ivy had begun to claim them. Maria Conceição walked at the front of the small procession, her shawl now lowered, revealing chestnut hair gathered in a bun that had once been elegant. At 31 years old, she carried the serene beauty of someone who had learned to find dignity in solitude. Her hands, delicate but calloused by the work that family decay had imposed upon her, still held the wicker basket, now empty, after being shared with the children. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of souls that had recognized each other, each carrying their own healed wounds. Rosa no longer cried, lulled by the gentle rhythm of footsteps and by the jasmine aroma that emanated from the woman's hair. Sebastian stayed close to Joachim, his dark eyes absorbing every detail of the path, as if he wanted to memorize the route back, if necessary. Francisca, the most observant of the group, noticed the wooden cross that hung from Maria Conceicão's neck, swaying gently with each step. It was a simple cross, worn by use, similar to the one her own mother used to kiss in hours of affliction. The discovery brought her a timid relief. Perhaps God had not abandoned them completely. When they reached the house's veranda, Maria Conceição turned to them for the first time since the station. Her eyes, the color of dark honey, scanned each small face with a tenderness that didn't dare reveal itself completely. "You must be hungry," she said simply, her voice carrying the sweet accent of the Recôncavo. "And tired, too." Joachim, always the protector, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we don't want to cause trouble. We can sleep on the veranda itself and leave in the morning if—" "Nonsense," interrupted Maria Conceição, with a gentle firmness that admitted no discussion. "This house is too big for one person alone, and you—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "You seem to be needing a place to stay." She opened the main door, which creaked on hinges, unaccustomed to movement. The interior of the house revealed the same dignified melancholy as the exterior. Dark furniture covered by white sheets, dusty family portraits on the walls, and a soft aroma of beeswax mixed with the ancient smell of wood and memories. Rosa was the first to enter, her childish curiosity overcoming shyness. Her small steps echoed on the jacaranda flooring, and she stopped before a large mirror with a golden frame that reflected her tiny image in the spacious vestibule. "Mama said that mirrors keep pieces of the people who look in them," whispered Francisca, approaching the younger sister. "Do you think there are still pieces of your family in there?" Maria Conceição felt a tightening in her chest. "Perhaps," she murmured, "but there's always room for new pieces." It was Sebastian who, without anyone expecting it, walked to the grand piano that occupied a corner of the room. His small hands delicately touched the keys, drawing loose notes that spread through the environment like liberated birds. The sound seemed to awaken the house from its long sleep. Maria Conceição observed the boy with surprise. It was the first time she had seen him do anything besides simply following the others. There was something musical in his movements, a delicacy that contrasted with the mutism that accompanied him. "He likes music," explained Joachim, approaching. Before we were left alone, our mother used to sing to him to sleep. Since then, he doesn't speak, but he still listens," completed Maria Conceição, understanding. She addressed Sebastian carefully. "Do you want me to play something for you?" The boy stepped away from the piano and nodded shyly. Maria Conceição sat on the cushioned bench and let her fingers run over the keys in a soft melody, a lullaby she had learned from her own mother decades ago. The music filled the dusty corners of the house, carrying with it the promise that there, in that place touched by nostalgia, there could still be room for hope. But outside, in the shadows of the deepening afternoon, other eyes watched the house. Eyes that saw opportunity where Maria Conceição saw only children in need of care. The following morning brought with it the song of the great Kiskadis and the aroma of roasted coffee that emanated from the mill's kitchen. Maria Conceição had awakened before sunrise, as was her custom, but this time she didn't find the usual solitude. Small sounds came from the guest room where she had installed the children. Low whispers, cautious steps, the soft creaking of wood under bare feet. When she went down to the kitchen, she found Joachim already awake, sitting at the large table of light wood where generations of the Cavalcanti family had taken their meals. The boy looked out the window that faced the yard, where ancient sugar ovens stood like monuments to a more prosperous time. "Good morning," said Maria Conceição softly, so as not to startle him. "Good morning, ma'am," replied Joachim, rising quickly. "Can I help with something? I know how to take care of animals, sweep, carry heavy things." Maria Conceição smiled at the boy's seriousness. "First breakfast, then we'll talk about work." It was then that they heard footsteps on the stairs, followed by a sweet and strong voice. "Good morning, children of God, and how did you sleep in this blessed house?" The voice belonged to a black woman of majestic bearing who descended the stairs with the ease of someone who knew each step by heart. Her graying hair was tied in a colorful headscarf, and her large hands carried a tray with steaming tapiocas. "This is Aunt Joanna," introduced Maria Conceição. "She takes care of everything here at the mill. And Aunt Joanna, these are—" "I know who they are," interrupted the woman, setting the tray on the table and examining each child with experienced eyes. "They're the train children, aren't they? News flies fast around these parts." Francisca descended the stairs at that moment, bringing Rosa by the hand and followed by Sebastian. The 11-year-old girl made a small curtsy before Aunt Joanna, a gesture that drew a smile from the older woman. "She has manners, that one," observed Aunt Joanna. "And you, little girl, what's your name?" "Francisca, ma'am. But you can call me Chiquinha," replied the girl, lowering her eyes shyly. "And this little one is Rosa?" asked Aunt Joanna, kneeling to be at the height of the smaller girl. "What a beautiful name. Rosa like the flowers that your Aunt Joanna plants in the garden." Rosa hid her face in Francisca's skirt, but peeked through her fingers when Aunt Joanna offered her a still-hot tapioca filled with grated coconut. Sebastian stayed close to the wall, observing. Aunt Joanna noticed him and approached him carefully. "And you, my son, what's your name?" Joachim stepped forward. "His name is Sebastian, but let him answer," said Aunt Joanna gently, extending a hand toward the boy. "Everyone has a right to their own voice, even if sometimes it needs a little time to appear." Sebastian looked at the extended hand, then at the woman's kind face. Slowly, he placed his little hand in hers. He didn't speak, but his eyes filled with a solitary tear that Aunt Joanna wiped away with delicacy. "There," she murmured. "Now you're already family." Maria Conceição watched the scene with a warm heart. Aunt Joanna had a natural wisdom that she herself, with all her education, sometimes envied. The woman had been born a slave on the very plantation, but had been freed by Maria Conceição's parents when she was still young. She had chosen to stay, becoming more than an employee. She was the guardian of traditions, secrets, and affections of the house. "Aunt Joanna," said Maria Conceição, "do you think the old Agregado's house would be in condition to—" "I already thought of that, child," interrupted the woman with a knowing smile. "The house needs a good cleaning and some repairs, but nothing that can't be solved. The children can stay here in the big house meanwhile, no problem." "We don't want to cause trouble," repeated Joachim, but his voice carried less conviction than the day before. "Work is what keeps life going, boy," replied Aunt Joanna, and this house was needing new life. At that moment, the sound of approaching hooves made everyone look toward the window. A man mounted on a bay horse stopped in the yard, his imposing presence contrasting with the peaceful morning that was unfolding. "Colonel Augusto," murmured Maria Conceição, and there was something in her voice that made the children instinctively draw closer to each other. The man dismounted and walked toward the house with firm steps. He was tall, middle-aged, with well-trimmed moustaches and clothes that spoke of wealth and power, but there was something in his eyes that didn't match the cordial smile he stamped on his face. "Good morning, Conceição," he called, stopping at the veranda. "I heard you received interesting visitors yesterday." The children didn't know it yet, but they had just met the first dark cloud in their new sky of hope. Colonel Augusto Viana radiated the type of authority that builds upon fear and dependence of others. His small, calculating eyes surveyed the group gathered on the gallery like a merchant evaluating merchandise, and there was in his smile a coldness that contrasted with the forced cordiality of his words. "What a beautiful family gathering," he commented, removing his hat in an exaggerated courtesy. "I see that the loneliness of the farm has finally come to an end. Isn't that right, Conceição?" Maria Conceição remained upright, but Aunt Joanna noticed how her fingers contracted almost imperceptibly as she held her skirt. "Good morning, Colonel. How can I help you?" Oh, so formal." He laughed, but the sound didn't reach his eyes. "I came merely as a good neighbor, offering help. I heard you picked up some abandoned children, and I thought perhaps you didn't quite know what you'd gotten yourself into." Joachim stepped forward, instinctively protective, but Aunt Joanna placed a hand on his shoulder to restrain him. The woman had known Augusto Viana long enough to know he never appeared without ulterior motives. "The children are well cared for, thank you," replied Maria Conceição, her voice firm despite the growing tension. "Ah, I don't doubt your good intentions, my dear," said Augusto, moving closer. "But raising children is a serious matter. It's expensive, and we all know of the difficulties the farm has been facing." Rosa hid behind Francisca, instinctively feeling the hostility emanating from the man. Sebastian remained motionless, but his dark eyes didn't stop observing every movement of the visitor. "That's why I came to offer a solution," continued Augusto, taking out a handkerchief from his pocket to wipe his sweaty forehead. "I know families in Salvador, people of means, who would be willing to take in these children, give them education, a future. You understand? What kind of families? Asked Joachim, his voice higher than he intended. Augusto looked at him with poorly disguised contempt. Families who know the value of work, boy, who can teach useful trades. Don't worry, you won't go hungry or cold. They won't go hungry or cold here either, interrupted Maria Conceição, finally understanding the true nature of the colonel's offer. Aunt Joanna stepped forward, her voice loaded with an authority that surprised even Augusto. Colonel, you know as well as I do that a child is not merchandise to be sold or traded. These children found a home here, and here they're going to stay. Augusto's smile disappeared completely. Be careful with your words, negress. Don't forget your place. My place is beside this family, replied Aunt Joanna without hesitation, as it always has been. The silence that followed carried unspoken threats. Augusto put his hat back on, but not before casting one last meaningful look at the children. Think carefully about my proposal, Conceição, he said, mounting his horse. Raising children without adequate resources could be considered negligence, and the authorities take these matters very seriously. He left immediately, leaving a cloud of dust and unease. Maria Conceição remained on the gallery until the sound of hooves was lost in the distance, then knelt before the children. You don't need to be afraid, she said, her voice more determined than ever. Nobody is going to separate you. Nobody is going to take you from here against your will. But what if he comes back with the authorities? Asked Francisca, hugging Rosa tighter. Aunt Joanna approached, her eyes shining with sagacity accumulated over decades of life. Then we're going to be prepared. Because, my daughter, sometimes good people need to be as cunning as bad people. Joachim looked at Maria Conceição with gratitude he couldn't express in words. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely alone in the responsibility of protecting the younger ones. What are we going to do? He asked simply. Maria Conceição stood up, and there was a new determination in her posture. We're going to turn this house into a real home, and we're going to prove that sometimes the family we choose is stronger than any threat. But while she spoke, her eyes searched the horizon, where a new figure was approaching along the dusty road. This time someone who would bring not threats, but hope. The man who approached walked with the upright posture of someone who carried books instead of weapons, knowledge instead of imposed authority. José Benedicto dos Santos had dark skin worked by the sun and calloused hands of someone who had known both manual and intellectual labor. At 38 years old, he brought in his eyes the serenity of someone who had found his life's purpose. A canvas bag hung from his shoulder, along with a leather satchel that protected his most precious books. His firm steps raised small clouds of dust on the road, and there was in his gait a determination that spoke of long journeys and noble purposes. Maria Conceição spotted him first, shading her eyes from the sun with her hand. Something in his figure immediately transmitted to her a sense of security, perhaps the way he stopped respectfully at the gate, waiting for permission to enter, or the delicacy with which he adjusted his hat before announcing himself. "Good morning," he said, removing his hat completely. "I am José Benedicto dos Santos. I heard there were children here who might need instruction." Aunt Joanna, who had observed the approach from the kitchen window, immediately descended the gallery steps. There was something in the man's bearing that awakened her curiosity and respect. "Professor José," she exclaimed, surprising everyone. "I heard about you in Salvador. They say you teach the children of freed people to read and write." José Benedicto smiled, and his smile carried genuine humility. "I teach whoever wants to learn, Donna Joanna." "Everyone calls me Aunt Joanna," she replied, "and this is Señora Maria Conceição, owner of the farm." The children approached slowly, attracted by curiosity. Joachim stayed slightly in front of the younger ones, still in the protector role, but there was less tension in his shoulders than during the colonel's visit. "These are the children," presented Maria Conceição. "Joachim, Francisca, Rosa, and Sebastián." José Benedicto crouched down to be at their height, a gesture that immediately reassured them. "It's a pleasure to meet you," he said, and there was genuine interest in his voice. "Would you like to learn to read?" "I already know a little," said Francisca shyly. "My mother taught me some words from the Bible." "Excellent," responded José Benedicto, his eyes lighting up. "And you?" he addressed Joachim. "I know how to write my name," admitted the boy, "but I'd like to learn more." Rosa peeked from behind Francisca, clearly interested but still wary. José Benedicto noticed her curiosity and took from his satchel a small book with a faded blue cover. "This book has stories of princes and princesses," he said gently. "Would you like me to read you one?" Rosa nodded enthusiastically, and even Sebastian moved a little closer. José Benedicto opened the book to a page illustrated with simple but colorful drawings. "Once upon a time there was a princess who lived in a very tall tower," he began, his voice modulated and captivating. While he read, Maria Concheição observed the children's expressions. It was the first time she had seen them completely absorbed in something that wasn't worry or fear. Even Sebastian seemed hypnotized by the narrative. When the story ended, José Benedicto closed the book carefully. "If you learn to read," he said, "you'll be able to discover all these stories by yourselves, and who knows, maybe even write new stories." "Can you teach us?" asked Joaquim, his eyes shining with a hope he hadn't felt for a long time. José Benedicto looked at Maria Conceição, seeking confirmation. She nodded almost imperceptibly. "It would be an honor," he replied, "but we would need a suitable place for lessons, some books, paper." "The house library has been closed for years," said Maria Conceição thoughtfully, "but it has books, a large table. Could it work?" Aunt Joanna clapped enthusiastically. "What a wonderful idea! That library needs new life." José Benedicto stood up, adjusting the satchel on his shoulder. "If you permit me, I would very much like to see that library. And," he hesitated for a moment, "I would also like to talk about the difficulties you might be facing." "I heard that Colonel Augusto was here." Maria Conceição's smile faded slightly. "News travels fast, especially the bad ones," agreed José Benedicto. "But sometimes good news also reaches those who need to hear it. For example, the news that there are people willing to defend what is just." There was something in his voice that suggested knowledge and experience in dealing with men like Augusto Viana. Maria Conceição wondered what other skills besides teaching this gentle man might possess. "Come," she said, heading toward the house. "Let's see if we can transform a dusty library into a place of learning." As they climbed the gallery steps, none of them noticed the solitary rider who observed from afar, hidden among the trees along the road. Augusto Viana was back, and this time he hadn't come alone. May 1888 brought with it winds of change that blew over all of Brazil, carrying perfumes of orange blossoms and the promise of freedom that had long floated in the air like a whispered prayer. In the small registry office of Cachoeira, among yellowed papers and the sweet smell of melted wax, two stories of liberation intertwined into one. Maria Conceição nervously adjusted the jasmine flowers that Aunt Joanna had woven into her hair. The dress she had worn at her sister's wedding years ago had been carefully altered by skillful hands, gaining an elegant simplicity that matched the sobriety of the moment. It wasn't a wedding like those her family used to celebrate. There was no orchestra, nor illustrious guests, nor sumptuous banquet. But there was something more valuable. There was love born of trust, mutual respect, and the certainty that two lonely hearts could become a home. José Benedicto waited before the improvised altar, wearing his best linen jacket, hands clasped behind his back in a posture that revealed both nervousness and determination. In the months that followed his arrival, he had become more than a teacher. He was counselor, protector, and gradually companion. His conversations with Maria Conceição extended through afternoons under the shade of cashew trees, talking about books, dreams for the children, a future they would build together. The four children occupied the first bench of the small chapel, their clothes carefully ironed by Aunt Joanna, who had categorically refused to let her boys attend the wedding, looking just any way. Joaquim, now 14 years old and noticeably taller, held Rosa in his lap so she could see better. The girl, now 6 years old, swung her legs with the contained excitement of someone witnessing something magical. Francisca, at 12 years old, had become the little lady of the house, helping Aunt Joanna with domestic care and demonstrating domestic wisdom that impressed the adults. Her eyes shone with emotion while she firmly held Sebastian's hand. The boy, who had turned 9 without yet uttering a word, observed everything with intense attention that spoke of deep understanding, even without voice. The priest, a kind man who had known José Benedicto through his educational activities, conducted the ceremony with gentle solemnity. It was when he was pronouncing the words about union and companionship that a murmur began to form outside the church. "Freedom!" shouted someone in the street. "The princess signed. Slavery is over." The priest stopped in the middle of the blessing, his eyes widening. José Benedicto and Maria Conceição looked at each other, immediately understanding the magnitude of the moment. It wasn't just a wedding being celebrated, it was the birth of a new country, a new era. "My children," said the priest, his voice laden with emotion. "You are marrying on the day that all of Brazil marries freedom. May God bless this double union." Aunt Joanna, who watched from the church door, let tears run freely down her face. She had been born a slave on that very land, had grown up hoping for this day without ever being certain she would see it. Now, at 58 years old, she witnessed not only the freedom of her people, but also the consolidation of the family she had chosen as her own. When José Benedicto and Maria Conceição kissed, sealing the union, the church bells began to ring, not just for the wedding, but for the freedom that swept the entire country. The children applauded enthusiastically, Rosa shouting, "Hooray!" with her clear little voice. The celebration that followed was simple but full of meaning. In the farm's yard, under the lights of lanterns hung between trees, neighbors and agregados gathered in a celebration that mixed matrimonial joy and libertarian euphoria. José Benedicto played guitar while voices joined in songs that spoke of hope and new beginnings. Sebastián, to everyone's surprise, approached the guitar when José Benedicto paused. For the first time since arriving at the farm, the boy opened his mouth. No words came out, but a sweet and melancholic melody, a whistle that seemed to carry all the emotions he hadn't been able to express in words. Joachim embraced his younger brother, understanding that this was a moment of healing. Francisca dried the tears in her eyes, and Rosa clapped her hands, asking, "More music, Bastián, more music." Maria Conceição, now Maria Conceição dos Santos, danced her first dance as a married woman under the stars that witnessed so many transformations. In José Benedicto's arms, she felt she had finally found her place in the world, not as the spinster of a decadent family, but as matriarch of a chosen family, built on love and purpose. But not even the joy of that double night of celebration managed to completely drive away the shadows. On the other side of the property, Augusto Viana watched the party lights with eyes full of resentment. Abolition had complicated his plans, but hadn't made them impossible. Orphaned children were still vulnerable, especially when laws were changing so rapidly that nobody knew for certain what was legal or not. And he was determined to prove that happy endings didn't always last forever. The autumn of 1888 brought with it more than dry leaves and cold wind. It brought justice officials, sealed papers, and the acrid smell of fear that Augusto Viana knew how to cultivate, as well as his sugarcane fields. The formal denunciation of abandonment of minors and improper appropriation of orphans arrived on a leaden sky morning, brought by two men in wrinkled uniforms who could barely disguise their discomfort at fulfilling orders they didn't fully understand. Maria Conceição received the documents with trembling hands, but maintained her dignity intact, while José Benedicto read each line with the attention of someone who knew the legal traps that could hide between the lines. The children watched from the top of the stairs, their little bodies pressed between the balusters, trying to understand why there was so much tension in the air. 15 days, murmured José Benedicto, folding the papers carefully. "We have 15 days to prove that the children are well cared for and that our guardianship is legitimate." Aunt Joanna came down from the kitchen, drying her hands on her apron, her expression loaded with the wisdom of someone who had seen many battles. "And what are we going to do, my son?" José Benedicto went to his desk, where he kept correspondence that he had maintained in secret until that moment. "We're going to fight with their own weapons, legally and politically." The letters he withdrew from the drawer revealed a network of contacts that surprised even Maria Conceição. Correspondence with Joaquim Nabuco, with abolitionist leaders from Salvador, with lawyers who defended the rights of freed people and the dispossessed. José Benedicto wasn't just an itinerant teacher. He was part of a larger movement, an underground current of people who believed that freedom meant more than simply not being enslaved. "You never told me," whispered Maria Conceição, delicately touching one of the letters. "Some secrets must be preserved until it's safe to reveal them," he replied, but there was tenderness in his voice. "And now the time has come to use all the resources we have." In the days that followed, the farm transformed into a center of feverish activity. José Benedicto wrote urgent letters to his contacts, meticulously documenting the children's progress, their health, their education. Joaquim, who now read fluently, helped copy testimonies. Francisca, with her careful handwriting, transcribed lessons that Sebastián had done, proving that even without speaking, the boy learned and developed. Sebastián, in turn, created something nobody expected: drawings. Pages and pages of drawings that told the story of his arrival at the farm, the care received, the transformation of 4 abandoned children into a family. His strokes, though simple, carried an emotion that dispensed with words. Rosa, the youngest, was transformed by the situation into a small, eloquent witness. At just 6 years old, she could clearly express how she felt safe and loved, how she liked studying, how she didn't want to go anywhere. The day of the trial came accompanied by a fine rain that transformed Cachoeira's streets into rivers of mud. The improvised tribunal in the municipal chamber hall buzzed with curious onlookers, supporters and detractors. Augusto Viana arrived accompanied by a lawyer from Salvador, a man with waxed mustaches and an impeccable suit that contrasted with the rural simplicity of the environment. Maria Conceição wore her wedding dress, carefully cleaned and pressed. José Benedicto wore his best jacket and carried a leather briefcase full of documents he hoped would be sufficient to keep the family together. The children sat in the first row, clean and well-dressed, but visibly nervous. Joaquim held Rosa's hand, who in turn clung to Francisca's arm. Sebastian watched everything with his large, dark eyes, as if he wanted to memorize every detail. The judge, a middle-aged man who looked like he'd prefer to be resolving less emotionally complicated matters, opened the hearing with bureaucratic formality. "We are here to determine whether the Santos couple is fit to maintain guardianship of the minors, Francisca, Rosa, and the minor Sebastian, as well as young Joaquim, who is approaching the age of majority." Augusto Viana stood first, his lawyer presenting arguments about financial instability and social inadequacy. They spoke about a single woman who had married an ex-slave, about the inability to provide adequate education, about the social isolation the children would face. But when it was José Benedicto's turn to defend himself, he stood with the dignity of someone carrying not just his own future, but the future of 4 precious lives. "Your Honor," he began, his clear and firm voice echoing through the packed hall, "the people accusing us speak of inadequacy, but I ask, inadequacy for what? For transforming abandoned children into dignified human beings, for teaching them to read, write, dream." And then, in a move nobody expected, he called his own witnesses. One by one, people he had known in his journey arrived at the tribunal. Ex-slaves he had taught to read who were now prosperous small merchants, teachers from Salvador who attested to his competence, and to general surprise, a representative of Joaquim Nabucco who brought an official letter supporting the Santos family. The decisive moment came when the judge asked the children where they would like to stay. One by one, they stood up and declared, with small but firm voices, that they wanted to remain with Maria Conceição and José Benedicto. And then, the miracle nobody expected happened. Sebastian stood up and, for the first time in years, spoke. "I want to stay with my family," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse but clear as crystal. "This is my real family." The silence that followed was deafening. Tears ran down Maria Conceição's face, and even the judge seemed moved. The decision, when it came, was unanimous. The children would remain with the Santos family. But as they left the tribunal under the applause of those present, nobody noticed the look of pure hatred that Augusto Viana directed at them. This battle was lost, but the war wasn't over yet. The beginning of 1889 brought with it more than just a new year. It brought the definitive legal confirmation of the children's guardianship, and with it, a sense of stability that the Santos family hadn't known since it was formed. The official documents, with their seals and elaborate signatures, rested in a simple frame on the living room wall, not as a trophy of victory, but as a reminder that justice sometimes really did prevail. José Benedicto had expanded his educational activities far beyond the farm's limits. 3 times a week, he walked to the village headquarters to teach children of ex-slaves and agregados who sought in education the gateway to a new world. His reputation as an educator had spread, and families from neighboring settlements sent their children to study at what everyone began calling Professor Benedicto's school. Maria Conceição, in turn, had discovered in herself a vocation she had never imagined possessing. Besides being an adoptive mother, she had become a kind of counselor for other women in the region who faced the changes brought by abolition. Widows of small landowners, ex-slaves who needed to learn to navigate freedom, single girls who sought alternatives to arranged marriage, all found in her house a space of welcome and guidance. Joaquim, now 15 years old, had revealed himself not just as a brilliant student, but as a natural teacher. His mornings were dedicated to studies with José Benedicto, but his afternoons were spent teaching the smaller children of the neighborhood. There was in him a natural patience and ability to explain complex concepts, simply that impressed even experienced educators. "The boy has a calling," commented the local vicar after observing one of his improvised classes in the churchyard. "He should go to the seminary or maybe to Salvador, study at the Lyceum." Joaquim, when he learned of the comment, talked at length with José Benedicto and Maria Conceição about his future plans. The idea of leaving the family to study in the capital caused him deep anguish, but also awakened an ambition he tried to hide. "I want to study more," he confessed one afternoon, while they walked through the coffee plantation that José Benedicto had begun to cultivate. "But I don't want to abandon you, not after everything we've been through." "The abandonment would be not pursuing your dreams," replied José Benedicto gently. "A real family doesn't imprison its members. It prepares them to fly." Francisca, at 13 years old, had developed a special talent for caring for people. Whenever someone in the neighborhood got sick, they called for Chiquinha from the mill, who arrived with her home remedies and a serenity that calmed both patients and their families. Aunt Joanna, recognizing the girl's gift, began teaching her secrets of folk medicine that had been passed down through generations. "This girl is going to be a midwife," prophesied the older woman. "She has blessed hands and a pure heart. That's all you need to bring life into the world." Sebastian, now that he had recovered his speech, revealed himself as a natural storyteller. His experiences of silence had sharpened his capacity for observation, and he could capture details and nuances that others missed. He began writing small chronicles about life on the farm, simple but deep stories that José Benedicto read aloud to neighbors on evening gatherings. Rosa, the youngest, developed like a sponge that absorbed knowledge. At 7 years old, she already read better than many older children and demonstrated an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond the farm's borders. Her drawing notebooks filled with imaginary maps of places she wanted to know. It was during one of these afternoons of development and growth that news arrived that would definitively confirm the Santos family's transformation into a respected force in the community. An official emissary from Salvador brought a formal proposal. José Benedicto was invited to establish an official school in the region, with financial support from the provincial government and legal recognition of his educational methods. The proposal included not just resources for building an adequate school, but also the offer of study scholarships for promising students, including Joaquim. "It's more than we dreamed," whispered Maria Conceição, reading the official documents for the third time. "It's recognition that we made the right choice," replied José Benedicto, embracing her. The children received the news with a mixture of joy and apprehension. The school meant greater opportunities, but also changes. Joaquim would stay in the region for another year, helping with the construction and organization of the new institution before leaving for Salvador for higher studies. "We're going to continue being a family," assured Maria Conceição, gathering everyone in a circle on the veranda. "Regardless of where life takes us, this house will always be the heart that keeps us united." Aunt Joanna, watching the scene from her favorite rocking chair, smiled with the satisfaction of someone who helped plant a tree and lives to see its fruits. "Look at that," she murmured to herself. "From 4 children lost at a train station, a whole school was born." But life, as José Benedicto well knew, rarely allows happiness to be lasting without new challenges. And the next challenge that was approaching would be bigger than any they had faced before, because this time it wasn't just about preserving a family, but creating a legacy. The autumn of 1892 painted the leaves golden when the Santa Conceição School officially opened its doors, emerging from the old flour mill like a phoenix reborn from ashes. The adobe walls were plastered and whitewashed, the windows enlarged to allow more natural light into the classrooms, and a bronze bell, a donation from a family that benefited from the education offered, crowned the small bell tower built especially to mark lesson times. José Benedicto, now officially recognized as director of the institution, walked through the corridors, observing with pride the fruits of 4 years of hard work. 85 students of various ages occupied the 5 classrooms, from 6-year-old children learning their first letters to gray-haired adults who could finally realize the dream of signing their own names. Joaquim, at 17 years old, was officially the assistant teacher, but everyone knew his responsibilities went far beyond the title. He had specialized in teaching the older students, ex-slaves who worked during the day and came to study at dusk. His infinite patience and ability to understand the specific difficulties of those learning late made him an exceptional educator. Professor Joaquim called Donna Benedicta, a 52-year-old ex-slave who had begun attending the night classes. "Could you please explain this cursive writing again? My hand still doesn't obey well." Joaquim approached the improvised desk, his gentle hands guiding the woman's calloused fingers over the paper. "Slowly, Donna Benedicta. Cursive writing is like a dance. You have to find the rhythm before trying speed." Francisca, at 15 years old, had become the most sought-after midwife in the region. Her delicate hands and knowledge of medicinal herbs had already brought 17 babies into the world, all healthy and crying vigorously at birth. But her heart had recently been divided. Antonio, a young teacher from a neighboring community, came to court her with handwritten poems and flowers picked along the way. "He's a good boy," Aunt Joanna had commented one afternoon, watching Antonio teach Rosa to make paper kites. "And he has the same polite manner as Professor Benedicto. I think he'll make a good husband." Sebastian, now 12 years old and completely recovered from his mutism, had become the school's official chronicler, his notebooks filled with accounts of the ex-slaves' lives, their stories of suffering and overcoming, their hopes for their children. The boy had a special ability to make people open up, telling him secrets and memories they kept in the depths of their hearts. Rosa, at 9 years old, was considered the school's child prodigy. She spoke Portuguese fluently, understood basic French that José Benedicto had taught her, and demonstrated a mathematical aptitude that surprised even the most skeptical visitors. But what impressed most was her ability to teach other children, transforming complex lessons into games that facilitated learning. The school functioned in an unprecedented partnership with the Genealogical Institute of Bahia, which regularly sent books, didactic materials, and even visiting teachers. The experience of educating ex-slaves and their children had begun to attract national attention, with educators from other states coming to observe the methods developed by José Benedicto. Maria Conceição, now known affectionately as Mama Conceição by the entire student community, managed the practical aspects of the school with an efficiency that impressed government inspectors. She organized community meals offered to the poorest students, coordinated activities for women who attended sewing and embroidery classes, and maintained active correspondence with educators throughout Bahia. A special afternoon in that autumn of 1892 brought a visit none of them would forget. Joaquim Nabuco himself arrived at the school, accompanied by 2 assistants and a journalist from Rio de Janeiro. The great abolitionist, now dedicated to understanding the developments of freedom, wanted to personally know the educational experience that had become a national reference. "Impressive," he commented, observing a class where black and white children studied together, something still rare in the country. "You're not just educating people, you're building Brazil's future." José Benedicto received the visit with the humility characteristic of him, but there was pride in his eyes when he showed the students' work, the community gardens maintained by the school, the small library that grew with monthly donations. "Education is the safest path to dignity," he explained to the journalist who was frantically taking notes. "These children and adults aren't just students, they're citizens in formation." Joaquim Nabuco lingered talking with Joaquim, impressed with the young teacher's maturity and knowledge. "You should come to Rio de Janeiro," he suggested. "There are universities there that need educators with your social sensitivity." "For now, my place is here," replied Joaquim respectfully. "There's still much work to be done." The visit ended with an official photo of the entire school gathered in the yard, an image that would later be published in newspapers of various capitals of the country. In it, the Santos family appears in the center, José Benedicto in a dark suit with a serious but gentle expression, Maria Conceição in her Sunday dress with a serene smile, and the 4 children who arrived orphaned and abandoned, now transformed into young citizens full of purpose. But there was something more in that photo that would only be perceived years later. In the background, almost imperceptible, the silhouette of Aunt Joanna watching from the kitchen window, her calloused hands holding a dish towel, her eyes shining with tears of pride. Life still reserved for them a surprise greater than any public recognition. The winter of 1893 arrived laden with cold winds and a cholera epidemic that swept the region like a hungry ghost, taking precious lives and leaving entire families in mourning. The Santa Conceição school temporarily transformed into a medical support post, with Francisca and Aunt Joanna preparing medicinal teas and José Benedicto organizing food distribution for the most affected families. It was in this scenario of adversity that Maria Conceicão, at 36 years old, discovered something she had long given up hoping for. She was expecting a child. The discovery came on a June morning, when the nausea she had attributed to the stress of the epidemic became impossible to ignore. Francisca, with her 16 years and growing experience in births and medical care, was the first to suspect and delicately suggested to her adoptive mother that she observed the signals her own body was sending. "It can't be," whispered Maria Conceicão, her hands instinctively searching her still flat belly. "The doctor said, years ago he said it would be impossible." "Doctors sometimes make mistakes," replied Francisca, with the wisdom of someone who had already witnessed many miracles. "And God has his own plans, even when we think we already know the end of the story." José Benedicto received the news with a mixture of ecstatic joy and deep concern. At 42 years old, he would be a father for the first time, but the region's sanitary conditions, aggravated by the epidemic, made the pregnancy a considerable risk. "We're going to be even more careful," he said, embracing his wife with a tenderness she would never forget. "This child is already a miracle before even being born." The other children received the news each in their own way. Joaquim, now an 18-year-old young man about to leave for Salvador for higher studies, felt a mixture of joy and additional responsibility. Rosa, at 10 years old, was excited about the prospect of having a baby to care for. Sebastian, always observant, began writing small poems about the arrival of life in difficult times. Aunt Joanna, with her 60 years of experience in births and care, took command of preparations with military efficiency. "This house has seen many births," she declared, organizing white sheets and preparing traditional herbs, "and all of them brought blessings." As the months passed and winter gave way to the spring of 1894, Maria Conceicão's belly grew like a promise of hope amid the devastation caused by the epidemic. The school continued functioning, but with redoubled care for hygiene and ventilation that José Benedicto had implemented following more modern medical guidelines. The baby seemed to have chosen the right moment to be born. The cholera epidemic had finally subsided. Families were beginning to recover, and the community was slowly returning to normal when, on a sunny morning in March 1894, Maria Conceicão felt the first contractions. The birth was long, but without serious complications. Francisca assisted Aunt Joanna with a competence that impressed the older woman, while José Benedicto walked nervously around the yard, followed by the other 3 children who didn't want to stray far from home. When the baby's first cry echoed through the house, it was as if all of nature stopped to listen. A strong, indignant cry, full of life and determination. "It's a girl!" shouted Aunt Joanna from the bedroom window. "A perfect girl, Maria de Conceicão Santos," for that's what she was baptized, came into the world weighing little more than 2 kilos, but with powerful lungs and closed fists as if she were ready to face any challenge. Her dark eyes, when they finally opened, seemed to already carry the ancestral wisdom of the strong women of her lineage. José Benedicto held his daughter for the first time with trembling hands of emotion. "She's going to grow up free," he whispered, "free from everything we had to overcome." Joaquim, who had postponed his departure to Salvador until after the birth, observed his youngest sister with a tenderness that surprised him. "I'm going to study even more," he promised, "to help build a better world for her." Little Maria de Conceicão seemed to have brought with her not just joy, but also a renewal of purpose for the entire family. The school flourished even more, the farm's plantations became more productive, and even the most skeptical neighbors began to recognize that there was something special about the Santos family. Aunt Joanna, rocking the child on a lazy afternoon, looked toward the verdant fields that extended beyond the veranda and murmured, "This girl is going to see things we can't even imagine. She's going to grow up in a world where being black and free won't be news, where a woman can study whatever she wants, where the impossible becomes routine," completed Maria Conceicão, watching her daughter fall asleep in the adoptive grandmother's arms. And while the family adjusted to the presence of the new member, none of them could imagine that this tiny creature would grow to become the first black teacher graduated from the normal school of Bahia, or that her name would be remembered decades later as a symbol of a generation that transformed impossible dreams into everyday reality. But that's a story to be told at another time. For now, the simple miracle of a new life flourishing on finally free land was enough. The year 1894 brought with it transformations that surpassed the borders of the Santa Conceição farm and reverberated throughout the entire Recôncavo Baiano region. The Santa Conceição School had become a beacon of educational hope, attracting not only local students, but also families from distant villages who migrated near the institution in search of a better future for their children. Joaquim, now 18 years old and finally ready to leave for Salvador, said goodbye to the family on an April morning, loaded with emotion and expectation. His suitcases contained not only clothes and personal books, but also a letter of recommendation signed by José Benedicto and a handful of earth from the farm that Rosa had insisted he take as a memento. "This earth has memory," said the 10-year-old girl, with the seriousness that sometimes amazed adults. "It will remember you to return." Joaquim knelt to kiss the forehead of little Maria de Conceição, who now crawled across the wide wooden floor of the veranda, her curious eyes following every movement of the older brother. "When I return," he promised, "you'll already be walking and talking, and I'll have many stories to tell." Maria Conceição held back tears while embracing the boy who had arrived in her life as a frightened child and now left as a determined and educated man. José Benedicto, moved but proud, shook the young teacher's hand. "Always remember where you came from," he told him, "and more importantly, remember where you're going." Francisca, who had turned 17 and made official her engagement to Antonio, the teacher from the neighboring community, watched the adoptive brother's departure with a mixture of sadness and hope. She herself would begin a new life in a few months, moving to her future husband's house after the wedding, scheduled for the end of the year. "The family isn't separating," murmured Aunt Joanna, holding Rosa's hand, while the horse-carrying Joaquim disappeared around the bend of the road. "It's growing and spreading like a big tree that plants seeds in new soil." Sebastian, at 13 years old, had become the official observer of family transformations. His notebooks filled with reflections on changes, on how time took people away but also brought others near. He had begun corresponding with a newspaper in Cachoeira, sending small chronicles about rural life that were published anonymously as Letters from a Young Sertanejo. Rosa, the most studious of all, absorbed knowledge with a veracity that impressed even José Benedicto. At 10 years old, she already read in French, understood advanced mathematical concepts, and demonstrated a natural talent for sciences that made her adoptive father dream of possibilities that a few years ago would have been unthinkable for a black girl in the interior of Bahia. "This girl is going far," prophesied Aunt Joanna whenever she observed Rosa bent over geography books, tracing imaginary routes on maps. "She's going to know places we don't even dream exist." The Santa Conceição School continued growing and transforming. José Benedicto had implemented a scholarship system for the most promising students, financed through donations from former students who now occupied respectable positions in larger cities. 3 ex-slaves who learned to read at the school had become prosperous small merchants and always sent part of their earnings to help maintain the institution. Maria Conceição, still recovering from childbirth but full of renewed energy, had created a special program for mothers who wanted to study but had nowhere to leave their small children. The morning classes for women included a space where babies could stay under care while their mothers learned to read and write. "Education can't wait for convenience," she explained to visitors who came to know the project. "It has to adapt to people's real lives." The wedding of Francisca and Antonio, held in a simple but moving ceremony at the local chapel, marked an important transition in family dynamics. The young midwife would remain in the region, but now would have her own house and her own responsibilities. Her wedding dress, sewn by Aunt Joanna with fabric donated by one of the families benefited by the school, symbolized the continuity of family traditions even amid changes. "You will always be our daughter," said Maria Conceição, adjusting the simple but elegant veil of the bride, "and your house will always be an extension of ours." Sebastian composed a special poem for his sister's wedding, recited at the party that followed the ceremony. His words spoke of roots that remain strong even when branches spread, of love that multiplies instead of dividing, of families that choose each other and reconstruct themselves through affection and mutual care. Rosa, as maid of honor, carried the simple gold rings on an embroidered pillow that she herself had made during sewing classes. Her eyes shone with the understanding that she was witnessing a historic moment in the evolution of the family that had given her identity and purpose. Little Maria de Conceição, now a few months old and already showing the determined personality that would characterize her for life, attended the ceremony in Aunt Joanna's lap, her little dark eyes absorbing the colors, sounds, and atmosphere of celebration that surrounded her. When the party ended and the last guests departed, the family gathered on the veranda, observed the stars that twinkled over Bahia like small promises that the future, however uncertain it might be, was full of infinite possibilities. José Benedicto held Maria Conceição's hand while they watched Sebastián and Rosa playing with the baby on the floor, their laughter echoing through the warm night. "We did it," he whispered. "We built something that will last beyond us." "We began," she corrected him gently. "What we achieved was to start something that other people will continue and perfect." And they were right, for in the years that would follow, the seeds planted in those initial years would flourish in ways that not even their most ambitious imaginations could anticipate. The winter of 1895 painted the fields golden and brought with it transformations that definitively consolidated the Santa Conceição School as a respected institution not only in Bahia, but throughout the country. Letters arrived regularly from educators in Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and even Minas Gerais, asking for information about the pedagogical methods developed by José Benedicto and his team. The school now functioned in 3 shifts: morning for younger children, afternoon for youth who helped their families with rural work, and night for adults who finally had the opportunity to learn to read. The number of students had grown to 123, representing families from more than 15 different communities. Joaquim wrote regularly from Salvador, where he was taking the humanities course at the provincial lyceum. His letters brought not only news of his studies, but also reflections on the political changes the country was going through with the consolidation of the Republic. He maintained correspondence with other young black educators who, like him, saw in education the key to true social integration. "Dear family," he wrote in a June letter, "here in Salvador I met other teachers who, like you, believe that education can transform not just individuals, but entire society. We're organizing an educators' congress to discuss specialized teaching methods for ex-slaves and their descendants. I would very much like Papa José to come represent our school." José Benedicto read the letter aloud during dinner, his pride evident in the way he pronounced each word. The idea of presenting the school's work at a national congress excited and at the same time made him nervous. "You should go," encouraged Maria Conceição, gently rocking little Maria de Conceição, who now at 1.5 years was already walking and speaking single words. "The world needs to know what we're doing here." Francisca, who now lived in the neighboring community but visited the family weekly, had brought important news on the last visit. She was expecting her first child. At 18 years old, she continued exercising her vocation as midwife, but was now also preparing for motherhood, with a mixture of anxiety and joy. "The baby will be born at the end of summer," she had announced, her hands instinctively protecting her still small belly, "and I would like it to be here at home with you nearby." Aunt Joanna had received the news with tears of happiness. At 62 years old, she was preparing to become a great-grandmother of the heart, a role she would assume with her usual dedication. Sebastián, now 14 years old and official correspondent for the Cachoeira Journal, had developed a special talent for documenting the region's social transformations. His articles about the lives of ex-slaves and their families were read not only locally, but republished in newspapers from other cities. He was beginning to gain a small reputation as a young social chronicler. "The boy writes better than many educated people," the newspaper editor had commented during a visit to the school. "He has an eye for details that matter and a heart for stories that need to be told." Rosa, at 11 years old, had officially become the school's first student to master 3 languages. Besides Portuguese and French, José Benedicto had obtained basic English books through a contact in Salvador, and the girl absorbed the new language with the ease of a sponge. Her curiosity about the outside world had intensified, and she spent hours studying maps and atlases, dreaming of distant places. "When I grow up," she said, "I want to know other countries where people learn to live together without caring about skin color." Little Maria de Conceição, who would turn 2 the following March, already showed signs of the strong personality that would characterize her. She spoke in complete sentences, asked questions about everything she saw, and had a natural curiosity that made adults laugh and wonder at the same time. "Mama, why are flowers different colors?" she had asked one morning, observing the garden that Aunt Joanna cultivated with so much care. "To make the world more beautiful," Maria Conceição had replied, surprising herself with the depth of such a small child's question. The Educators' Congress that Joaquim referred to in his letters ended up happening in Salvador at the end of 1895. José Benedicto traveled to the capital carrying documents, school photographs, and samples of students' work. His presentation on adaptive pedagogical methods for marginalized populations caused significant impact among the educators present. During his week-long absence, Maria Concepcion completely took over the school's direction, demonstrating administrative abilities that surprised even herself. Classes continued normally, special projects proceeded, and she still managed to organize an end-of-year party that brought the entire community together in the farm's yard. When José Benedicto returned, he brought with him not only official recognition of the work done at the school, but also a concrete proposal. The Bahian government offered financial support for creating a normal school in the region, specialized in training teachers for rural communities. It would be the first of its kind in the interior, he explained, gathering the family around the dining table. And you girls, he looked at Rosa and little Maria da Concepcion, would be the first official students when the time came. The proposal represented not just growth, but complete transformation. The small school that had been born from the desire to educate 4 orphan children was about to become an institution that would train teachers for all of northeastern Brazil. Aunt Joanna, observing the general excitement, smiled with the wisdom of someone who had seen a seed she herself had helped plant germinate. Sometimes, she murmured, one plants a flower and harvests an entire forest. And while they planned the school's future and dreamed of the possibilities that were opening up, none of them could imagine they were building a legacy that would influence Brazilian education for decades. The summer of 1896 arrived laden with surprises that would forever transform the Santos family's understanding of their own history. The revelation began with an unexpected letter brought by an official messenger from Salvador on a suffocating January afternoon, when the hot air made the cashew leaves curve as if begging clemency from the implacable sun. The letter bore the official seal of the capital's registry office and was personally addressed to José Benedicto dos Santos. He received it with curiosity, since he wasn't expecting official correspondence from Salvador, but when he began reading its contents, his hands began to tremble in a way Maria Concepcion had never witnessed. "What happened?" she asked, approaching with little Maria da Concepcion in her arms. "Bad news?" José Benedicto raised his eyes from the paper, and there was in them a mixture of amazement and emotion that left all present in suspense. Sebastian, who was writing in his usual notebook on the veranda, stopped with his pen in the air. Rosa, who was studying French at the big table in the living room, closed her book and approached. "They're not bad news," said José Benedicto slowly. "They're impossible, or rather, they're revelations about things we thought impossible." He sat heavily in the rocking chair that had become his favorite place for serious conversations and breathed deeply before continuing. "This letter is from a private investigator hired by Colonel Augusto Viana." The name fell like a stone in the calm lake of the afternoon. It had been more than a year since they'd heard from the man who had tried to separate their family, and everyone had assumed he would finally give up his persecutions. "What does he want now?" asked Maria Concepcion, instinctively pressing her daughter against her chest. "He doesn't want anything," replied José Benedicto, his voice laden with growing incredulity. "He's dead. He died 3 months ago from yellow fever. But before dying, he left instructions for this investigator to discover the truth about the children's origins." Aunt Joanna, who had approached silently from the kitchen, sensing that something important was happening, put her hand on Sebastian's shoulder. The boy, now 15 years old, had visibly paled. "The truth about what?" whispered Rosa. José Benedicto looked at each of the adopted children before continuing. "Augusto Viana didn't want the children to sell them as workers. He wanted them because he knew who they were. He knew where they had come from." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. "According to the investigations reported in this letter," continued José Benedicto, "you 4 aren't common orphans abandoned at a station. You are direct descendants of the Cavalcanti Menezes family, one of Bahia's oldest lineages." Maria Concepcion let out a muffled cry of surprise. Cavalcanti Menezes was her maternal grandmother's maiden name, a wealthy family that had lost everything during the wars of independence. "Impossible," she murmured. "The investigator traced the records," explained José Benedicto, consulting the letter again. "Your father, children, was João Cavalcanti Menezes, bastard son of one of the family heirs. When the family lost its properties, he moved to the interior with an ex-slave woman, your mother. They lived as agregados on various farms until both died in a smallpox epidemic." Sebastian was the first to find his voice. Why did Colonel Augusto know this, and we didn't? Because, replied Jose Benedicto, turning the page of the letter, he was your father's bastard brother, son of the same master with another slave. When he learned you were alive and in the region, he wanted to have you under his control, probably to claim some inheritance in the family's name. Rosa stood up abruptly, her legs wavering. So we are related to Mama Conceição? Distant cousins, confirmed Jose Benedicto. Which means that you were always truly family, completed Aunt Joanna, her voice laden with emotion. Destiny just brought you together before you discovered it. Maria Conceição began to cry, but they were tears of joy mixed with amazement she still couldn't completely process. That explains so many things, she whispered. The ease with which you adapted here, the way Sebastian was enchanted by the piano, how Rosa absorbs knowledge, and it explains why Augusto never gave up pursuing us, added Sebastian, always perceptive. He didn't just want worker children. He wanted to control the family inheritance. Jose Benedicto folded the letter carefully. There's one more piece of information. With Augusto's death and the discovery of your origins, you have legal right to claim part of the family properties that still exist. Land in Salvador, a house in the city. We don't want it, said Rosa immediately. We don't want anything that comes from that man or from that family that never cared about us. This is our family, agreed Sebastian, gesturing to include everyone present. This is our house. This is our true inheritance. Maria Conceição looked around, seeing in the faces she loved confirmation of something she had always known in her heart. Family wasn't a matter of blood, but of choice, care, and love. Let's burn the letter, she decided, and never speak of this again. We're Santos, all of us, and we always will be. But while Jose Benedicto walked toward the stove to destroy the documents, Aunt Joanna stopped him with a gesture. Wait, she said. Maybe we should keep this, not for the inheritance, but for history. Your children, she looked at little Maria da Conceição, and their children will want to know where they came from. Every family needs to know its own history, and so the letter was kept in the bottom of a drawer, along with other important family documents. Not as a claim to lost wealth, but as a reminder that sometimes destiny has more elaborate plans than anyone could imagine. That night, gathered on the veranda under the familiar stars, they felt more united than ever. The revelation hadn't changed who they were. It had only confirmed that love had reasons that reason itself didn't know. The year 1897 arrived laden with promises and consolidations that would forever mark the history of the Santos family and the community they had helped build. The Reconcavo Normal School, finally approved by the state government, rose majestically where once only the modest farm school had functioned. Its red brick walls and wide windows symbolized not just institutional growth, but the transformation of a dream into concrete reality. Joaquim had returned from Salvador at the beginning of the year, bringing with him not only his normal teacher diploma, but also a marriage proposal for Rosa, now 13 years old, and considered the most intelligent young woman in the entire region. He had decided to run for city councilman of Cachoeira, becoming the first black man to officially campaign in the city's history. Education gave me a voice, he had declared during the first campaign meeting held in the schoolyard. Now I want to use that voice to ensure other people have the same opportunities I had. Maria Conceição, watching the boy who had arrived as a frightened child and now spoke with the authority of a statesman, felt her heart overflow with maternal pride. Jose Benedicto, officially appointed director of the normal school, divided his time between classes and the political advice he gave his adoptive son. Francisca, now mother of 2 small children, João, 2 years old, and newborn Conceição, baptized in honor of her adoptive grandmother, had established herself as the most respected midwife in 3 neighboring municipalities. Her techniques, which mixed traditional knowledge with new medical practices, learned through manuals that Jose Benedicto obtained from Salvador, had drastically reduced infant mortality in the region. Sebastian, at 16 years old, had become the official correspondent for 2 important newspapers in the Bahian capital. His articles about social transformation in the interior were beginning to influence education public policies throughout the state. He maintained an epistolary romance with a young teacher from Salvador and planned to ask her to marry as soon as he turned 18. Rosa had exceeded all imaginable academic expectations. At 13 years old, she mastered 4 languages, understood advanced mathematics and political geography in a way that impressed visiting university professors. Her admission to the College of Bahia, as the first black woman in the institution's history, had been approved unanimously, opening precedents that would forever change Brazilian higher education. "This girl is going to know the world," prophesied Aunt Joanna, now 65 years old but still strong and lucid. "And the world is going to remember her." Little Maria de Conceição, about to turn 3 years old, already spoke Portuguese and French fluently, demonstrating intellectual precocity that fascinated and sometimes worried her parents. Her complex questions about justice, equality, and human rights surprised adults and suggested a mind that processed concepts far beyond her age. "Papa, why do some people have big houses and others don't have any house at all?" she had asked one morning, observing a family of migrants passing along the road. The question had led José Benedicto to a profound explanation about social inequality, fundamental rights, and collective responsibility, a conversation the girl followed with total attention, asking questions that would reveal years later the foundations of her future career as a human rights lawyer. Joaquim's campaign for councilman mobilized the entire community. Former school students returned from distant cities to vote. Entire families organized to ensure all voters could reach the polls, and even small children participated, distributing pamphlets and singing campaign songs. The election results, announced on a hot October night, echoed throughout Bahia. Joaquim dos Santos had been elected with the highest vote count in Cachoeira's history, becoming not only the first black man to occupy a seat in the municipal chamber, but also the Republic's youngest councilman. "Today," he declared in his victory speech, delivered on the steps of the same train station where everything had begun 10 years before, "we proved that education can transform not just individual lives, but all of society. Every child who learns to read is a seed of change that will flourish for generations." Rosa, who would leave for Salvador the following week to begin her secondary studies, watched her brother with tears of pride in her eyes. She had decided to study medicine, specializing in pediatrics, determined to care for children as she herself had been cared for. Francisca, holding her youngest daughter in her lap, whispered to Maria Conceição, "Mama, you did it. You managed to create a generation that's going to change Brazil." Maria Conceição, now 42 years old, and recognized as one of the state's most respected educators, smiled with the serenity of someone who had seen impossible dreams become everyday reality. "We did it," she corrected her gently. "All of us, together." José Benedicto, observing the family gathered on the veranda of the house that had become home to so many hearts, reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them there. From 4 abandoned children and a single woman, they had transformed into an educational force that influenced public policies in 3 states. "What do you think our children will achieve?" he asked, pointing to little Maria de Conceição, who played on the floor with wooden blocks that Sebastian had made for her. Aunt Joanna, gently rocking in her favorite chair, looked toward the horizon where the first stars were beginning to appear. "They're going to achieve things we don't even dream are possible," she replied with absolute certainty, "because we gave them the most powerful thing that exists, the certainty that every human being has the right to dignity, education, and love." And while night fell over the Santa Conceição farm, carrying with it the soft voices of the gathered family and the sweet aroma of flowers that perfumed the air, it was clear they had built more than a school or even a family. They had planted the seeds of a future where equality and justice would no longer be distant dreams, but realities conquered through education, love, and unwavering determination. The story that had begun at an abandoned train station had transformed into a legacy that would resonate through generations, proving that sometimes the greatest transformations are born from the simplest gestures of compassion and courage.